The fire took her husband, her home, and even her dog, but not the one thing she didn't know she still had: the will to start again. And when a burned stranger appeared on the trail, he didn't offer words, just silence, and a hand to rebuild what was lost. The morning after the fire, the ground still smoked in places, curling up tendrils of gray like the last breath of a dying thing. Mara stood barefoot in the cinders, toes blackened, her dress clinging with damp ash and soot, her face blank and still. In one hand she held the warped iron skillet she'd used every morning for 6 years, its handle now blistered and bent. In the other, a simple gold ring, too hot to touch when she'd first found it near the hearth, now cool and dull in her palm. Her thumb moved over it slowly, not to clean it, just to remember the shape. The cabin was gone, not just burned, but eaten, chewed down to black bones and broken glass. Where her husband's tools once hung, there was a pile of twisted metal. Where the apricot tree had shaded their porch, only a charred trunk stood, weeping sap like old tears. The garden was gone too, nothing but scorched earth and the scent of burnt dill still sharp in the air. Their dog, Finch, hadn't made it. She'd found what was left of him near the back, curled up by the door that wouldn't open in time. She didn't look long. She couldn't. Someone said lightning had struck in the night. A freak storm, a dry flash. Others whispered it was the stove, maybe left burning too long. Mara didn't believe either. She remembered the scent of kerosene, the way the flames moved too fast, too hot. Her husband, Will, had tried to get to the door, to wake her, but the smoke had been too thick, the wood already groaning. He'd shoved her out the back window, cut her arm on the way, shouted something she didn't understand, then vanished in the blaze before she could turn back. No one from town stayed long that morning. They came, offered quiet condolences, handed her water and pity, then wandered off as if her loss might rub off on them. Someone had pressed a blanket around her shoulders. She didn't remember who. She let it slide off before noon, the smell of wool too heavy, too clean. By the time the sun was high and the last ember had cooled, she was alone again. No home, no husband, no dog. No proof she'd ever belonged to anyone or anywhere except for the mark on her arm and the ring in her hand. She stood there a long while, listening to the wind whistle through the bones of what used to be her life, then tucked the ring into the front pocket of her scorched dress and turned away. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay. Not where the air still smelled of smoke and sorrow, not where every step felt like walking through a graveyard. So she walked, barefoot on the hard dirt, leaving behind the skillet, the ashes, the questions no one dared answer. The world didn't stop for her grief. The sky stayed blue. The birds still flew. But in Mara's chest, something had gone quiet and cold, like a fire burned too long with nothing left to warm. Mara spotted him just past the bend, where the valley dipped low and the grass turned gold with sun. He was crouched beside a mule, its back leg drawn up tight, and the air around him was so still it felt like walking into someone else's prayer. She slowed but didn't call out. Her feet were blistered, her dress still stiff with ash, but something in the way the stranger moved, slow, careful, unhurried, made her pause. He didn't look up right away, just tied off the mule's leg with a strip of canvas and rested his hand on its shoulder until the animal stopped trembling. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were shaded by the brim of a sweat-stained hat, the kind worn long enough to forget where it came from. A rag wrapped his right hand, dark with old blood and fresh blisters, the fabric curling at the edges. Burned, maybe worse. Mara didn't speak first. Words had felt useless since the fire, but she didn't turn either. She just stood there, waiting. He gave a nod, nothing more, then pointed past a cluster of boulders where cottonwoods leaned over a narrow stream. "Water's clean there," he said, his voice rough like he didn't use it much. She moved toward the stream, not thanking him, not looking back. The water was cold enough to sting, and she cupped it in her hands, drinking until her throat stopped aching. She washed her arms, her face, then pulled the hem of her dress into the stream and scrubbed without much care. It didn't help. The soot had sunk too deep. When she returned, he was still with the mule, tightening the pack saddle, checking the hooves. He didn't ask her name, or what had sent her walking barefoot through the wild, with ash on her face and smoke in her hair. He didn't need to. Her silence matched his, and something about that made her feel less hollow. He looked like he'd come from nowhere. His coat was patched with pieces from coats that didn't match, one sleeve darker than the other, one cuff missing entirely. His boots were worn, the kind that had walked too far and still kept going. He smelled faintly of smoke, though not the kind that clung to ruin. More like he carried fire with him and never let it burn all the way out. When the mule brayed, low and tired, he ran his unburned hand along its neck and murmured something too soft to catch. Then he looked at Mara and gave a short nod toward the trees. "Storm might come tonight," he said. She glanced at the sky, all blue and bright, no hint of clouds, and raised a brow. He didn't smile, just pulled his hat lower. "They come fast, this side of the ridge." He walked off after that, slow but sure, leading the mule toward higher ground. Mara hesitated. She didn't follow right away. But when the wind picked up and the first shiver crawled down her spine, she found herself trailing his path, drawn by the calm in his stride, the quiet weight in his presence, and the simple fact that for the first time in days, she didn't feel quite so alone. The fire was small, just enough to keep off the chill that settled deep after sunset. They didn't sit close to it, and they didn't sit close to each other. He stayed on one side, legs stretched out, shoulders leaning against a rock. She sat across from him, arms wrapped around her knees, blanket pulled tight over her back. The mule slept somewhere behind the trees, its quiet shifting barely a sound over the crackle of dry wood. He didn't speak, hadn't, since pointing out the storm that never came. He'd just stopped when the light faded, set his pack down without asking, and started gathering twigs like it was understood she'd be there too. Mara hadn't argued. She was tired of deciding where to go, tired of pretending she had a plan. So she stayed. He sharpened his knife slowly, rhythmically, like it was a habit more than a need. The scrape of stone on steel filled the space where talk might have gone. He didn't flinch when the wind blew smoke his way, didn't shift or curse or wave it off. He let it wrap around him, eyes half closed, as if smoke were just another thing he'd learned to live with. Mara watched him from across the flames, her fingers picking at the frayed edge of her sleeve. She didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't young, not exactly, but not old either. He moved like someone used to pain, like nothing surprised him anymore. And that was what made her curious. Not what he said, but what he didn't. He hadn't asked her where she came from, or why her boots were gone, or what had left her looking like she'd crawled out of the ruins of something lost. He didn't offer comfort either. Just space. Quiet. And for once, she didn't mind it. She dug through her satchel and pulled out a strip of jerky, tougher now than it had been when she packed it. She held it out across the fire, not speaking, not looking directly at him, just offering. He took it, nodded once, then bit down slow and chewed without sound. No thanks. No comment on how dry it was. No questions about whether she had more. She found she liked that. Grief, when spoken out loud, always sounded small and sharp, but in silence it felt honest, heavy but shared. After a while, she leaned back against her pack, listening to the way the fire snapped and the wind shifted through the pines. Somewhere nearby, an owl called out, its hoot soft and distant. The man, Elias, she thought he might have said once, glanced up at the sound but didn't move. She thought about speaking, about telling him her name, about asking his, but the words caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat, and just sat there. So instead, she lay down on her side, back to the fire, one hand still tucked in the warmth of her blanket. Across from her, he continued sharpening his knife, steady as ever, like the fire had no end, and neither of them were in a hurry to reach the next day. And for the first time since the fire, Mara felt the ache in her chest ease, not because she'd forgotten, but because someone else was near, not needing anything from her, not trying to fix what was broken. Just there, in the dark, with her. That was enough. The next morning, she rose before the sun. The fire nothing but pale gray ash. The world still wrapped in early chill. She didn't wake him. Just gathered her things in silence, slung her satchel over her shoulder, and started walking west. The way back to what was left. She didn't expect him to follow, didn't look to see if he did. But after a few miles, when she stopped at a stream to rinse the dust from her mouth, she heard the soft thump of the mule behind her. She turned just enough to glance, and there he was, same coat, same quiet, as if they'd agreed on something without ever speaking it. They traveled in silence again, the way they had before, not quite together but never far apart. She didn't ask him why he came. He didn't ask where they were going. The sun climbed high, then fell behind them, and when the blackened ridge of her homestead came into view, her steps slowed. The land looked worse than she remembered. The scorched earth spread wider, the bones of her cabin more jagged and broken. The apricot tree was nothing but a stump now, charred and cracked in the middle. The air still held the bitter scent of burnt wood. She stepped into the remains of what had been her home, toes pressing into cold ash. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't thought it would hurt this much to see again. Every corner was familiar, even in ruin. The stone chimney was still half standing. Her mother's pot, warped but whole, lay beside it. She crouched, lifted it gently, then set it back down. There was nothing to say. She expected him to stop at the edge, maybe tip his hat and turn away. But instead, he walked right in, glanced around without comment, and stepped over the bones of the porch. He grabbed hold of a half-burned beam, tested its weight, then looked at her and said, "We can use this." It wasn't a question, just a fact. She stared at him, then nodded. They worked that day without plan, without talk. She cleared the ashes by hand, scooping them into piles, wiping her face on her sleeve. He sorted the wood, picking out what hadn't been fully ruined. They worked until the sun hung low, and their hands were raw. He never told her what to do, and she never asked him what he wanted in return. They simply moved together, a rhythm forming between the scrape of wood and the thud of stones. That night they didn't build a fire. Too much ash still clung to the ground. They ate cold beans from a tin and sat on opposite sides of a fallen wall, watching the stars blink through the skeleton of what once was a roof. She didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because something had shifted. Something small but sure, like maybe the earth had stopped spinning backward. He handed her a strip of canvas to wrap around her blistered palm. She didn't thank him, but she didn't pull away either. They went to sleep side by side, the cabin walls still nothing more than memory and smoke, but the work begun. Not because anyone told them to, not because it made sense, but because something inside both of them had decided that starting over was better than staying broken. The hammer echoed through the valley like a steady heartbeat, slow and even, as Elias nailed another board into place. The walls were going up now, rough-cut pines stacked atop the blackened foundation. No windows yet, no roof, just a shape beginning to form where ruin once lay. Mara worked nearby, hauling stones from the creek to frame a chimney that might one day hold a fire again. Her back ached. Her hands bled in places, but the ache felt honest, the blood earned. She hadn't spoken much in days, hadn't needed to, not with him working beside her. But word has a way of traveling even faster than fire. By the end of the week, folks from town had started whispering. At first, it was just passing glances, sharp looks from wagon drivers and farmers on the road. Then came the questions asked to others when they thought she couldn't hear. Why was Mara letting a stranger stay on her land? What kind of woman loses her husband and takes up building with a drifter not a month later? What sort of grief looks like that? She ignored them, or tried to. Let the wind carry their words where the ashes used to blow. But the looks grew bolder, the voices closer, until one morning the preacher arrived, Reverend Clay, long-faced and sunburnt, with a Bible in one hand and judgment in the other. He didn't walk up to the cabin, just stood near the edge of the path, boots too clean for the dust. "You've been missed at services," he said, voice smooth but thin, like oil on cold water. "Folks are worried, saying things." Mara stood in the doorway, arms crossed, splinters in her sleeves, dirt under her nails. She said nothing. He looked past her to Elias, who stood on the porch roof, hammer in hand, frozen in motion. His eyes didn't leave the preacher, but he didn't speak either. I know grief can twist a person, the Reverend continued, looking back at her, can make them do things they wouldn't normally do. This land, it's hard now, maybe too hard for one woman to hold. We've got buyers interested. I'd be glad to help arrange a sale. You could come back to town, start over, properly. Still, she didn't speak. The Reverend shifted, clearly unsettled by her silence. He glanced again at Elias, then back at her. You don't have to let pain drive you into darkness. The Lord's house is open. So are good Christian homes. Mara stepped forward, just 1 foot onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath her heel. This is my home, she said softly. And he's the only one who helped me build it. Reverend Clay's jaw twitched. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, the wind tugging at the corner of his coat. We'll keep you in our prayers, he said. But it didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like a warning. He turned and left, boots crunching along the path. Neither Mara nor Elias watched him go. Instead, she walked over and picked up a new board. He held the hammer out to her, not offering, just waiting. She took it, placed the nail, and struck hard. Let them talk. Let them whisper. The walls were rising, and she was still standing. That was all that mattered now. Mara hadn't meant to go digging through the ashes again. The ground was still bitter there, blackened with memory, but she couldn't stop herself. The sky was gray that morning, soft with the promise of rain, and the new walls of the cabin stood like ribs waiting for a heart. She crouched near what used to be the hearth, where her rocking chair had once creaked in the evenings, and pushed aside a piece of collapsed timber. Beneath it lay something small, metal, curled and warped like a question mark. She brushed the soot away and blinked down at it. The music box. It was bent. The once polished tin now melted on one side, the painted roses barely more than smudges. The lid stuck when she tried to lift it, but after a twist and a tug, it gave with a soft snap. The winding key was still there. She didn't expect it to work, but her fingers moved anyway, turning it once, then twice. The gears groaned, stiff with heat and time. Then slowly, softly, it played. The tune was crooked, off-key in places, but it was there, faint and breathy, like something remembering itself. A lullaby her mother used to hum. Mara sat back on her heels, the sound wrapping around her like an old quilt, and for a long time she just listened. Then she carried it to the frame of the cabin, stepped up to the new window they'd cut into the south wall, and set it on the sill. The crooked tin caught the light. She didn't wipe it clean. That night, the rain came, gentle at first, then steady, pattering against the canvas stretched over their half-built roof. Elias was inside, seated on the floor near the fire pit they'd dug again. His boots were off, steam rising from his socks, his shirt damp across the shoulders. Mara brought in a small pot of water, set it near the coals, and knelt beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. The fire cracked, and the rain softened the air with that fresh, clean smell only a hard land could truly make. Then Elias reached into the pouch beside him and held something out, a spoon, carved smooth and curved just right to sit in a hand. Its wood was dark, the grain tight and twisting in places, a knot near the handle polished like stone. She took it slowly, fingers brushing his without meaning to. From the apricot tree, he said, voice quiet. Couldn't save it, but it'll still serve. She turned it over in her hand. The shape of it wasn't perfect, but the effort was. She felt it settle in her palm like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. Thank you, she said, the first real thank you she'd given in a long while. He nodded, pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, and leaned back against the wall. Outside, the wind picked up. The music box let out a single chime, sharp and soft like a memory being stirred, and Mara looked over at it glowing faintly on the windowsill, crooked but upright. Some things didn't survive fire, but some things did. Some things, even broken, still sang. The drifter showed up near dusk, slouched in the saddle of a horse too thin to carry him and too stubborn to stop. He reeked of whiskey and dust, his coat torn, one boot barely laced. He slid off the horse in front of the trading post like he owned the ground beneath him, mumbling something about bad roads and better luck. Mara had gone into town for flour, her first trip in weeks. She didn't plan to linger, just enough to get what they needed and go. But she heard him before she saw him. His voice was loud, laughing, slurring words to anyone who'd listen, or couldn't get away fast enough. He leaned against the water trough and waved a half-empty bottle at a group of men loading crates, his stories sprawling wider with every swig. "Easy job," he was saying, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth. "Real easy. Just light a match and ride. Some fellow owed money. Real stubborn sort. They said burn his place, scare him straight. Only he weren't in the house when it caught. His wife was. And the dog, too." He chuckled at that, like it was some punchline. Didn't even need the whole bottle of kerosene. Mara stopped in her tracks. The sack of flour slipped from her hands, hit the porch boards with a dull thump. Her mouth went dry. The drifter kept talking, but the words blurred in her ears. She stepped off the porch slowly, her boots heavy, her hands clenched at her sides. "What did you say?" she asked, voice low. The drifter blinked at her, swayed a little, then straightened. "Said it was a job. Nothing personal. Fella didn't pay. Boss made an example." "What was his name?" Her voice shook now, but not from fear. He shrugged, took another swig. "Hollis, maybe? Or, no, Harlan. Yeah, William Harlan. That was it. Stubborn mule of a man." The world narrowed. Her breath caught. Her husband's name rang like a bell through her bones. She took another step forward, fists curling tighter. Elias was beside her before she knew he'd moved, his presence calm but solid, a shadow at her back. The drifter squinted at him, his smile faltered. The bottle slipped a little in his grip. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "Didn't expect to see you this far west." He said a name then, short, sharp, something foreign to this place, not Elias, something old and dark and not meant for her ears. Mara looked at Elias, but he didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at the man like he was studying a storm on the horizon. "You riding with them again?" the drifter asked, trying to force a grin. "Didn't think you'd crawl back after what happened down by the border." Elias didn't answer. His silence was thick, the kind that carried more weight than words ever could. The drifter's smile faded. He stepped back, muttered something, and turned fast, stumbling toward his horse with more urgency than pride. He climbed into the saddle awkwardly and rode off without another word, dust trailing behind like smoke. Mara stood there, fists shaking, throat raw with things she wanted to scream. She turned to Elias, searching his face. "Was it true?" she asked. He didn't flinch, didn't lie. "Yes," he said. Just that. Nothing more. And it wasn't the answer that broke her. It was the way he said it, steady, without shame, but not proud either. Like a man who'd carried a weight so long he no longer expected to set it down. She looked away, the ache in her chest spreading wide, but she didn't walk off. Not yet. The fire was low that night, the kind meant more for company than heat. The stars blinked faintly behind a veil of drifting clouds, and the sound of crickets filled the quiet between them. Mara sat with her knees drawn up, her back resting against one of the cabin's new walls, half-framed and open to the wind. Elias sat across from her, sleeves rolled, hands resting on his knees. The mule dozed nearby, shifting its weight every now and then. Neither of them had spoken since the drifter rode off. The wind picked up, brushing through the trees, and Mara finally broke the silence. "Did you know it was our place?" Her voice was steady, but soft, like she wasn't sure she wanted the answer to be loud. Elias didn't look at her. He reached for a stick and stirred the coals. The red light danced across his face, highlighting the lines around his mouth, the scars on his knuckles. He didn't speak right away, but when he did, his voice was flat, not cold, not tired, just honest. "No," he said. Didn't know his name? Didn't know there'd be anyone inside? Mara didn't nod, didn't blink, just waited. He shifted slightly, pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, then looked up at the dark trees like he saw ghosts between the branches. I used to ride with a crew, he said. 5 of us. Took jobs nobody else wanted. Sometimes it was bounty work. Other times, he paused, rubbed the back of his neck with his burned hand. Other times it was worse. Mara stayed still. She didn't want to interrupt. She didn't want to ease his words or make him feel better. She just wanted the truth. There was a place down near San Miguel, he continued. Homestead. We were told the man inside had stolen from a banker, that he'd skipped town with gold that wasn't his. We came in the night, set fire to the barn first, then the house. Didn't check for anyone inside. His voice dropped lower. Turned out there was a woman. And a baby. The fire popped, a quiet crack that made the mules stir. Elias stared at the flames, unmoving. I left them that night, he said. Rode off with nothing. Didn't take my share. Didn't even say goodbye. Been walking ever since. He didn't say he was sorry. Didn't explain away the things he'd done or offer excuses. He just let the words hang there, thick with smoke and memory. Mara watched him carefully. She'd seen liars before. Seen men who twisted truth to suit their pride. But Elias didn't twist anything. He laid it out like a broken fence, splintered, plain, impossible to ignore. She didn't speak for a long time. The air around them shifted, colder now. She pulled her blanket tighter and looked away toward the stream, where the water caught faint moonlight through the brush. I don't forgive you, she said. And it wasn't cruel. It was just fact. I know, he replied. But you didn't lie, she added, more to herself than to him. And in that small space between truth and forgiveness, they both sat, 2 people with too much past and not enough future, listening to a fire they both knew could never burn clean, but still kept warm. The clouds rolled in slow but certain, thick and low like a warning whispered across the hills. The air turned sharp, cool against the warmth of late afternoon, and the birds went quiet. Mara stood near the edge of the garden they'd started, watching the sky with narrowed eyes, her hands still dirt-stained from digging. Behind her, the cabin stood half-finished, walls patched with uneven boards, the roof only half covered in tar cloth and pine planks. It wasn't much yet, but it was standing. When the first drop hit her cheek, she didn't flinch. She just closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the sky. Elias stepped out from the cabin's frame, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked up too, then toward her, but said nothing. There was no need. They both knew it was coming. The rain came hard and fast. No drizzle, no warning, just a sudden rush of cold water from the sky, drumming on the roof, slapping against the half-set stones of the chimney, soaking the earth in minutes. The dry ground drank it up greedily, but the unfinished parts of the cabin turned to a mess of slop and slipping boards. The mule snorted from under its lean-to, tail flicking. Mara didn't run for cover. Instead, she stepped forward, into the clearing, into the full downpour. Her boots sank into the mud, and then she kicked them off, toes sinking into the wet earth like roots finding home. She spread her arms out wide, let the rain hit her open-palmed, let it run through her hair and down her neck. It streaked the soot, still clinging to her skin, lifted the ash from her arms, rinsed away the weeks of sweat and smoke and grief. She laughed. It started small, just a breath that caught in her throat. Then it grew, a laugh that tumbled out of her chest, startled and sharp, like something long forgotten. It echoed across the clearing, cut through the storm, and curled into something that sounded like life. Elias didn't move at first. He just watched her, the rain slicking his hair, running down his jaw. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, not just surprise but awe, like he was seeing something holy. Not something made by God, but something made in defiance of everything that tried to burn her down. She turned to him, still laughing, her hair clinging to her cheeks, her dress soaked through. Her smile was wide, teeth bared, eyes bright in a way he hadn't seen since the day they met. She looked like someone who had crawled out of the fire and learned to dance in the rain. You coming in or not? she called through the storm. He stepped forward slowly, boots squelching in the mud, and raised a hand to brush the water from his brow. "You're gonna catch cold," he said, voice low but steady. She just laughed again, reached out, and pulled him into the rain with her. They stood there, soaked to the bone, not as builder and helper, not as stranger and widow, but as two souls still standing when the sky tried to drown what fire couldn't destroy. And in that rain-soaked clearing, with ashes long washed away, something new took root, something soft, quiet, and not yet named. The last board was nailed down just after noon, sun high and warm on their backs, the kind of warmth that didn't burn but lingered like a promise. Mara stepped back and looked at the cabin. Not much to anyone else, but to her, it stood like a monument. The walls were uneven in places, the roof patched with mismatched shingles, and the windows made from salvaged panes, some clouded with age. But it stood, upright and strong, with a door that closed proper and a chimney that pulled smoke just right. She ran her fingers along the rough frame, splinters catching in her calloused hands. It smelled of fresh wood and old ash, of clean earth and cooked beans. There were no fancy carvings, no curtains in the windows, no polished brass handles, but it was theirs. Built by hand, by will, by two people who didn't ask much from the world anymore, only that it let them try again. Inside, she lit the stove, her apron tied crooked over her hips, and stirred a pot of stew thick with rabbit, potato, and wild onions Elias had traded for in town. The smell filled the small space, curling into the beams and weaving into the walls. She hummed as she moved, quiet and low, a tune her mother once sang, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like borrowing someone else's life. Elias sat out front, working on something with his knife and a pile of old wood scraps. His hands moved slow, patient, shaving curls from the edge of a rough plank. Mara watched from the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, a soft smile hidden behind the steam rising from the stew. It took him 3 days to finish it. A rocking chair, simple and sturdy, its joints tight, its back curved just enough. He set it on the porch without a word, gave it a test rock with his boot, and then sat. The way the wood creaked made Mara's chest ache, not with pain, but with something quiet and full, like a song that didn't need singing. They fell into rhythm after that. She cooked. He fixed. She gathered herbs and washed clothes by the creek. He patched the roof when the wind tore a corner loose. They didn't speak more than needed. But it wasn't silence born of distance. It was comfort. The kind that lets breath fall naturally, lets hearts rest without guard. Evenings came slow, gold spilling across the porch, the sun dragging its feet across the hills. They sat there most nights, Mara on the step, Elias in the rocker, watching shadows stretch long and the world soften. Sometimes she brought out a cup of tea. Sometimes he handed her a carved trinket, rough but thoughtful. They never touched, never leaned in, but the space between them no longer felt like a gap. It felt like understanding. Mara would glance over at him, his face turned toward the light, and think, not for the first time, that maybe this was enough. Not the life she'd dreamed of as a girl, not the one she'd built with will, but something else entirely, something earned, something real. She didn't fear the dark anymore, not with him sitting just beside it, not with the cabin standing, fire crackling, and her heart beating steady for the first time in months. It was more than shelter. It was home. It started with the sound of hooves, heavy and slow, like trouble was giving them time to prepare. Mara looked up from the firewood she'd been splitting, sweat streaking her brow, and saw the dust first, then 3 riders coming over the ridge. The mule stirred in the corral, restless, and Elias stepped out of the cabin before she could call for him, wiping his hands on a rag and squinting into the sun. The riders didn't rush. They rode like men who knew the weight of fear and how to carry it slow, letting it stretch. The one in the middle had a scar that ran down the side of his face, pink and smooth and angry. His hat sat low, shadowing eyes that didn't need light to burn. He grinned as he got closer, a grin without kindness, and the sound of it when he finally laughed cracked the air like a whip. "Well, look what crawled out of the dirt," he said, reining in just short of the cabin. "Didn't think you'd grow roots, Elias." Elias didn't move. His jaw was tight, his hands loose at his sides, but there was no fear in him, only stillness. He glanced once at Mara, then back to the men. "You said you were done," the scarred man continued, swinging a leg over his saddle and dropping to the ground. His boots hit hard, dust kicking up. "But I see you found yourself a little nest. A woman, too. Didn't think that was your style." The others laughed. One spat near the porch step. The mule kicked at the fence. Mara stood behind the stack of wood, breathing slow. She hadn't asked Elias much about the men he rode with before, but she knew enough. She'd seen it in his silences, in the way he didn't sleep right on some nights, in the scars along his arms he never explained. She also knew he wasn't running. The scarred man stepped closer, eyes flicking over the porch, the rocking chair, the washed clothes hanging to dry. "You got soft," he said. "Or maybe you just got stupid." Elias didn't answer. That was when Mara moved. Quietly, without show, she stepped through the cabin door and picked up the rifle leaning beside it. Her husband's, Will's. The same one he used to hunt elk. The same one he'd taught her to shoot with back when the world still made sense. She stepped onto the porch, planted her feet, and leveled the rifle with both hands. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "You can leave," she said, "or you can bleed." The laughter stopped. The scarred man looked at her, something shifting behind his eyes. Not quite fear, but not amusement either. "You don't even know who we are," he said. "I know what you are," she replied, "and I've buried enough to know I won't do it again." Elias stepped forward then, slow and sure, standing beside her. Not in front, not shielding, just beside. The man looked at them both, spit on the dirt, and muttered something low to the others. They turned their horses without another word. No fight, no pride left to swing. Just the sound of hooves again, softer this time, like they'd lost whatever noise they thought they'd bring. When they were gone, Mara lowered the rifle but didn't relax. Not yet. Elias let out a breath he'd been holding. He looked at her like she was something he didn't deserve but would never walk away from. She didn't say anything, just turned and walked back inside, the weight of the gun still warm in her hands, her heart not pounding but steady. They had come looking to scare him, to shame him, but they had found something else entirely, something that wouldn't run, something that would stand. They never came back, whether it was something in Elias's eyes or the way Mara had stood with that rifle like she'd done it 100 times, no one knew for sure. But word must have spread, because no one else rode up that trail with trouble in their eyes. The cabin stayed untouched. The garden grew wild with beans and squash. The mule grew fat and lazy in the sun. The seasons shifted slow, like a song stretching long and quiet over the hills. The summer dried the creek down to a trickle, and Mara carried buckets from the well Elias dug by hand. Fall brought wind that tugged at the shutters and stripped the leaves bare, and they packed the gaps in the walls with moss and cloth, sealing the warmth in as best they could. Come winter, the snow piled thick around the porch, and the fire inside burned low but steady, never going out completely. There were hard days still. Crops failed some years, wolves got the chickens once, and sickness came and went with the cold. But the roof held, the walls stood, and Elias stayed. Mara found herself humming again, without meaning to, without realizing, the tune from the warped music box, off-key and cracked, but hers. She sang it while kneading bread, while washing clothes, while rocking in the chair he'd built with his own hands. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled and the fire hissed low, she'd sing it to the small bundle that now lay tucked against her chest, one hand curled near his face, his breath warm and steady against her collarbone. The baby had Elias's eyes, quiet, deep, watchful, but his mouth was always hungry, always asking. He cried like he expected someone to answer, and Mara always did. Not because it was easy, but because the ache in her chest that had once been grief was now something else, something tender and fierce and whole. She rocked him slow on the porch most evenings, wrapped in the same blanket she'd once carried after the fire, the chair creaking beneath her like the rhythm of a heart too stubborn to quit. Elias would sit beside her, sometimes whittling, sometimes just watching the sky turn from gold to purple. They didn't talk much about the past anymore. Some things had already burned. Others had been buried in the dirt and grown into something new. One evening, as the sun slipped low and painted the world in warm orange light, Elias reached over and brushed a curl of hair from her cheek. He didn't speak. He never did when it mattered most. But in that touch, she felt everything he'd never said. "Thank you. I see you. I'll never leave." And she didn't need more than that. The fire hadn't spared them. It had taken, and seared and swallowed. But what came after, what they built from the ash and ruin, was stronger than anything that had come before. Not just a cabin. Not just a home. It was a life. And as Mara held the baby close and hummed that crooked tune, she knew deep in her bones that sometimes the things worth keeping aren't the ones saved from the fire, but the ones built after it. Thank you for watching this story of fire, love, and rebuilding. If you felt something while listening, please give it a like. And if you want more stories that stay with you, hit that subscribe button and join us again.